Hey, thanks for joining us today. Today's going to be somewhat different than what we've had before. Rather than getting the insights of a number of people, we have the benefit of the thoughts and insights of Dr. Rachel York Colangelo. Dr. Colangelo is a doctor of legal psychology. She is the National Managing Director of Jury Consultant for Magna Legal Services, the folks who were generous enough to do this online mock jury for us. These exercises of online mock juries in terms of as a focus group with these hypothetical cases is invaluable. I mean, it's a type of thing that the plaintiffs have done frequently. That's how they come up with the reptile theory, rules of the road, other things. The type of thing we should be doing more of, and is what we've heard from the ASHRAE study going through this. So Dr. Colangelo and I will be going through and listening to some of the clips of the jurors so we can get the insight, their perspectives of that. And then I'll ask her comments and her thoughts afterwards, kind of channeling my my inner Andy Cohen. But, this is invaluable, and these perspectives are key for a number of reasons. First of all, we sometimes get and lose perspective, get caught up in the area of which we have, in what we see and we know. My good friend Steve Garrish, he refers to it when we speak together as being nose blind. Those commercials where the person's sitting in the room oblivious to the smell that's around them because they're used to it. That's why the commercial says you need to have a fresh perspective and find that out. Well, a couple of years ago, Magna Legal Services was, again, generous enough to do one of these that we use for presentations. And that one was focused on driver training, hiring, and supervision, particularly hiring. I developed a hypothetical case and a hypothetical background for this driver, driving record, MVR, nothing out of the ordinary from what we see, and presented to a jury after a fatal accident, hypothetical case. And again, the jury reacted as if, how could you dare let this guy on the road with a record like that? Well, at the first break, I had a safety director come up to me and said, that guy would have been my best driver. It is that different perspective we get. It's kind of like in normal times, I split my time between central Pennsylvania, rural area here, and California. And I am seen differently as seen as a conservative in California, liberal here in Pennsylvania. Both of them based upon the same thing, me driving a Prius with a gun rack. Well, let's go through this, see in terms of what the jury perspective is and what they bring to the courtroom, what they expect from you, the company, and what is the perspective of the jury, not just when you're testifying on trial, but how they consider you throughout the entire thing. And again, we thank Magna Legal Services for doing this and Dr. Colangelo for her time. Well, we're here today with Rachel York Colangelo. You've heard a lot from her so far in the seminar through the various clips we've done. We wanted to take some time. Magna was generous enough to do the mock jury, to bring them in, and you'll see the results of that. But we wanted to take the information and have the benefit of looking not just at the results of the jury, but some of the attitudes, some of the thoughts that they brought into and expressed in the deliberations that we normally don't get to hear except in circumstances like was done by Magna's case. So thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you again for doing the mock jury for us.
Absolutely.
Hey, one of the things is we're going to play a clip, but one of the attitudes of the juror in this clip is in terms of the award of the money to change the company attitude. Let's listen to the clip.
I think they should have total punitive damages. Like Grace, I would hope that they'd rethink the way they do business, which is questionable, but paying out all this money may make them think a little bit differently about the way they do things.
That takes any of the validity of my points away. I think that companies don't spend the resources they should to train their employees, and then people die. That's how it goes. So this is a classic, straightforward case of that, I think.
Yeah, Rachel, the expression of, "Gee, I hope this changes the conduct of the company," something that you run into quite frequently with jurors, particularly in this reptile era.
Very common among jurors over the last several years as reptile mania has kind of swept the litigation landscape. We hear this from jurors in almost every type of case in almost every venue around the country.
And how do you deal with it, or how do you tell your clients that you advise in these type of cases how to deal with this type of attitude?
Mm-hmm. So one of the primary ways to deal with it is actually during jury selection, addressing that elephant in the room during voir dire, bringing up the fact that you are representing a corporation whose conduct will be called into question, and asking jurors to make a commitment to you to fairly judge that company, and also to follow the judge's instructions on doing their duty in compensating the plaintiff, not necessarily wanting to punish a defendant if punitive damages are not at issue in the case.
Yeah, one of the things I do, Rachel, is at the beginning kind of try to plant that in voir dire, the notion of what their purpose is and what their role is in those perspectives, and then having, and many times in closing, reading off exactly what the judge is going to tell them in terms of what it is to focus on and how they're to deal with that.
Right. And I think it's important for defense counsel to highlight those key instructions, because we know that many times in the litany of instructions they're going to get from a judge, those really important ones can get lost. So when you sort of preview it for them, the jurors know to listen up.
Sometimes we'll even put it on the screen for them to read off of. And then
Exactly.
that way they get the visual impact as well. Well, one of the other things we heard, and we'll take a listen to it, where these jurors look beyond just the driver in this case, but look at the entire fleet of drivers. And this is what they had to say.
Like they're not taking care of what they're supposed to be. So if Mr. Peterson was getting by with what he got with, who knows what the other drivers are doing? Another accident is going to happen if they don't put more people in the office monitoring all these 85 drivers.
Punitive and compensatory, because the other drivers, I think they should be checked out too, because you may have another situation that comes up like that. What's with the other drivers? You may have another accident, and they need more supervision.
We had jurors there raise questions of, gee, if this driver's like this, what about the rest of them? And they should be, Rachel, your thoughts on that?
So this is an example of jurors playing right into that reptile strategy that you referenced earlier. These are jurors who are considering the conduct of the company as a whole. If this driver did something wrong or was negligent, then probably all of the drivers are negligent. So they're extrapolating outside of this particular case to what is this company doing in general that might be putting the public at large at risk. And that's when you start to get into these real feelings of fear, anger, and my verdict has to change this company's conduct in a broader way than just in this particular instance.
And I know in the limited time we have for this session, we can't get in depth in it, but does that go to, and the answer to that, a way to address it, is the whole kind of a counter-reptilian strategy on that, starting with the beginning and making sure we emphasize to the jury and to the judge what the purpose is and what they're doing in these situations.
Exactly. Just as we were talking about earlier, kind of informing the jurors about their role. If the case does not involve punitive damages, that this case is about this plaintiff, this set of facts, and not beyond that. And reminding them to sort of limit their role and not take on being sort of the champion or the guardian of the community. Also giving them the heads up that this reptile strategy is coming. Flag certain words for them. You might hear words like X, Y, and Z, safety, accountability. And when you hear those words, you know that that is a tactic the plaintiff is using to make you upset, to make you fearful. And when you give the jurors that sort of ammunition, they can listen out for those words and say, I'm not going to get caught up in this fear-mongering. I'm going to focus on the facts of this case.
And sometimes I think it's one of those things when you pull the curtain back and people see that someone's trying to do something to them, that kind of sets them off and kind of takes them the other way in that time.
That's exactly right.
Well, one of the jurors mentioned and had an interesting perception in terms of, or perspective, with regard to the increased role of trucking and the influence that e-commerce will have. And this is what that clip was.
We have now where there's so much e-commerce, we're going to see more and more and more truckers. So I think there needs to be greater regulations, especially if they plan to share the road with, regular Class C drivers.
Rachel, that type of perspective, we have a juror in a case, but they're looking at the entire industry and the role it's going to play in the future. Where does that come in?
Again, we're seeing a juror extrapolating beyond the case that they're being asked to judge. They're thinking about the role of trucks, truck drivers, companies in their communities at large, in our economy in general, and how a verdict in this particular case might affect that industry and the economy as a whole. That can become dangerous when jurors start to think about that, because they feel like now my verdict might have an impact on the industry as a whole, and they might feel that duty, if you will, to send a broader message, which often equates to higher damages.
And the answer, how do we respond to that then, Rachel?
Yeah, again, so we are wanting to refocus the jurors on this plaintiff, this defendant, this incident, and reminding them that they're not here to judge the conduct of the company as a whole, all of its drivers, all of its trucks, that they're not going to hear evidence about that, and it wouldn't be fair to judge this company on a more broader scale. Okay,
we're kind of moving beyond that. I'm going to play a couple clips, and this is the perspective of a juror, several jurors, in fact, in terms of, for lack of a better term, being overwhelmed by the size of the truck, or I guess maybe goes down to a lack of familiarity with it and being intimidated by it, and as a result, deriving their own perspective of that. And here's what those jurors had to say.
So I would expect extraordinarily stringent policies. If you're going to be driving, pretty much the behemoth of the road, I expect, with the technology we have now, that they, it's not only stringent, but also not very lenient.
People basically should have to, prove that they have a background of safe driving. It's a big, gigantic 80,000 pound truck that is, heavier than I think any of us can, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be. But, that is a weapon. That, people use that, use big trucks like that to drive into crowds and stuff like that. We need to make sure the people that are behind the wheel of, basically, enormous weapons that have the ability to plow through crowds or just, accidentally kill someone. We need to always make sure that we're giving we're putting in the resources. Companies that have the resources to put in are doing their due diligence to vet these people and check their application to make sure that they're telling the truth. That's how I feel. They don't staff up to what they need, or the structure isn't in place for people to be supervised in a way that is effective. And yeah, when you're putting people, I can't stress enough, when you're putting people behind heavy machinery like this and you're sending them out into the world representing your company, then you should treat it with care. That's such care, and stop trying to squeeze every ounce of profit you can out of something and just make something an actually good business model where your employees are set up to succeed rather than to, accidentally fall asleep at the wheel or kill people, whatever it might be at the time.
Yeah, Rachel, and I wrote them down here. Behemoth. People use trucks for weapons, piece of heavy machinery. Your response to that, and how do you deal with that in the terms of bringing jury perspectives back to where they're not having this misconception or this skewed conception of the trucking industry, and translating that into the verdict itself?
Yeah, these types of comments are very common among jurors in trucking cases. We hear that weapon. They talk about the sheer size of these vehicles. Common to hear things like, it takes them a long time to stop, and so they have to give even more room between other vehicles. So the knowledge that these trucks, these vehicles are harder to control than the passenger vehicles that jurors are driving also comes with the realization that an accident involving a truck is typically catastrophic. And this is reinforced by what people have seen on the highways themselves, what people might see in the news, that these truck accidents often end in severe injuries and death. It's typically not a minor fender bender. So they also realize that in those accidents, it's not usually the truck driver who's hurt, it's the other passengers in other vehicles. So again, it comes back to this idea that when you're in such a large, powerful machine, you are putting the public at risk just by nature of being on the road. So with that increased risk to a jury comes increased responsibility on the part of the individual driver as well as on the part of the companies for proper training, supervision, safety policies. So there are very high, often unrealistic and unfair expectations placed on the commercial trucking industry. Part of the way to combat that is through education. Jurors, most of them have never been in a semi-truck. They've never tried to drive one. They're just not aware of how driving these trucks actually works in reality. And beyond the education, it's about being proactive, telling a story on behalf of the company. How exactly are you making safety a priority? And jurors want to see not just lip service from a corporate rep, a C-suite executives. They want to see with their own eyes. Show me the physical evidence of your training policies, your hiring practices, your supervision, so that I can actually feel comfortable that, in fact, this company is taking its higher responsibility seriously and putting proper safety protocols in place.
One of the things that when I give presentations to groups such as this or to other safety officials, I say to them, look, think in terms of if you were on the witness stand and had to describe your safety program, okay, and you want to put it in the best light and have the best safety program, do it today. Do it now. Because after the accident, it's too late. It's not evidence, it's backfill. Right. And create that so that you can envision yourself being able to present that to a jury, to convey to them that level of safety to overcome this misperception or this skewed perception from being intimidated by the size of the vehicles.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such good advice. At every step of the way, the key is being proactive, not just reacting to litigation, but thinking about, as you said, if you had to essentially defend your company's safety policies on the stand, are there holes? Are there gaps in that safety policy that you might feel vulnerable about? And set about filling those gaps, if you will, so that you and everyone else who's going to be representing the company feel entirely confident in what your procedures are, and saying to these jurors, look, we know that there are perceptions out there about truck drivers, trucking companies. We are not one of those companies. This is not one of those drivers that you might have in your mind.
Well, I think one of the toughest things to dig into, but probably one of the most influential, and from my understanding, but you can correct me, Rachel, but my understanding is one of the biggest things that jurors have as an impact to bring to the courtroom are their own personal experiences. Yeah. And we have a juror who talks about an experience she had, and we'll listen to that clip right now.
For me, I think one of the things that really stands out is there was a lot of things about this case that were really reminiscent to something that actually happened very recently. In front of my own home, there was an accident with a truck driver who was negligent and actually killed a man, like, directly in front of the exit to my housing development last summer. And, you know, watching that whole thing play out, like, literally, like, watching it physically with my own eyes play out, there's a lot of similarities between that case and this case.
Okay, an accident, fortunately it didn't involve her, but it was near her house and had a profound impact on her. Voir dire, the place to get that, but I know it's often tough. They don't, you know, the judges aren't real generous with the time we have or our ability to question on that.
Yeah, definitely. If you can identify a juror like that during voir dire, you'll want to, but you're right, you might not always have the opportunity. And even if you do, what I've seen happen a lot is the judge or opposing counsel comes back and rehabilitates that juror and says, well, despite that experience, can you be fair and impartial in this case? And most often the juror says yes, because they truly believe that they can. They want to be fair and impartial. We know through a lot of research in psychology that people's personal experiences always influence our judgments, our decisions. They serve as a filter for that juror who observed a very traumatic accident outside of her neighborhood in which someone lost their life, this is going to influence her ideas about how often do accidents occur involving trucks? How severe are those accidents? And so she's already coming into your case with sort of a skewed perception because clearly that experience made a mark on her. So if you can't get that type of juror off for cause, you likely want to use a peremptory strike on that person. If you can't, if you're not in a situation to, you want to show that juror and the rest that this particular case was not perhaps like the experience that she had, and show all the ways in which this company maybe acted differently, this driver acted differently than that experience. But it's tough. We know those personal experiences are very powerful filters for jurors.
Yeah, I was the beneficiary of that one time. The case, they wanted over $1 million. We got a defense verdict. They go out in the hall. The foreman of the jury comes out and says, your driver was lucky that he didn't do this in Maryland. This had to be a Pennsylvania case. And I said, okay. So my father did the exact same thing, and they nailed him in Maryland for this. But, fortunately, you did this in Pennsylvania. I say, okay, I'll take it. But he felt an injustice to his father on that. Because it was a driver as well on that. Well, kind of talking about drivers and getting back on the subject, people have conceptions through mythology, whatever, of trucking. And these are expressed by several of these jurors.
Yes, the more loads you drop, the more money you make. So they gotta get them loads, drop them loads, and you come back and get another load. You get more, you get extra money that way.
Hi. Yep.
Well, I just worry about them being on the road, overdoing it. That's what I would call it. You have a certain amount of time that you can put on a log, but I also know that, when they used to do the paper logs, that they could be, fudged a little bit. And I don't know if this may have been a case too. Maybe he was overworked. He small company, maybe they didn't have enough drivers that day, had to put somebody else in, and he didn't have his 10 hours of rest. So, we don't know that. Wasn't brought up. But that would be my concern, is just to make sure that they're not overworked, because they do us a very big service, and they are very big trucks.
And also, they might be trying to make a deadline, need a deadline or something. He might be acting crazy because he's late or something happened like that. So they have to take all that into consideration also.
Okay. The myth in terms of the paper logs, or at least the perception people have, the starting point that they have in terms of paper logs and the veracity of them, the truthfulness of them, that truck drivers are always in a hurry, pushing to drive more. It's a matter of money. Your reaction and your response to that, Rachel?
My reaction is that this is very common, and it involves just sort of a lack of understanding. That I don't know how these myths, as you call them, have pervaded society, but they have. And I think it's through stories about bad accidents, and a journalist gets a hold of it and writes this sort of expose on, fabricated time logs, and the drivers are incentivized for doing more pickups and drop-offs. So people do have these ideas. So step one is, as we discussed earlier, a little bit of re-education, saying to the jurors, you might have heard stories. Those are the exception, not the rule. Here's how the trucking industry works. Here's how logs actually work. For example, we had a case in which the jurors were calling the driver's logs into question and suspecting that maybe he had falsified them. When we actually educated them on how this electronic log system worked, the jurors realized, he couldn't possibly have falsified it. Just can't happen. So educating them on the realities of trucking and how all of that works. But also, again, being proactive, telling this storyline about the company and all of the steps that the company takes. So I say that the jurors don't want lip service because they're expecting that the company reps will come in and say, we put safety first. Well, put your money where your mouth is. Show them at every step, beginning with hiring the drivers, maintaining the vehicles. What is it that you are doing out there every day to prevent things like a falsified log, a driver who's tired or rushing down the road?
You know, one of the things I'm doing now, or some of the things I'm doing now, Rachel, in these cases, kind of anticipating this, is to I'll bring in the logs and introduce them of our driver. And, you know, where the unknown is out there, taking that away and say, here are the logs. You know, they're all in order. Here's the cell phone record. Wasn't on the phone. Things that the jurors might try to conjure in their mind as an answer if they're not given one, if that gap's there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's kind of a little peripheral to the question, but, you know, jurors, my impression has always been that what I found is jurors will, given the opportunity, come up with their own answers. Yes. On these, if they have the opportunity. And either you've got to close that out, or you've got to, if you're working it in your direction, lead them up to the point without telling them, and then let them come to that conclusion, and then they'll never be shaken from that at that point in time.
That's such a good strategy. We recommend that in almost all of our cases. I call it the breadcrumb strategy. You're sort of dropping the crumbs for the jurors, but you're letting them come to the ultimate conclusion, because then it's not your idea, defense counsel, it was their idea. And like you said, the conviction, once they've come to their own conclusion, can be even stronger. You're also absolutely right that jurors are trying to form a narrative in their own minds of how did this accident happen, and any kind of gap they will fill in with an assumption. And unfortunately, in the trucking industry, those assumptions are often detrimental for the driver or the company. So anytime you do have that evidence to show them, you might have guessed he was on his cell phone, he wasn't. You know, here are the logs. One of the pieces of that puzzle now, more than ever, are the dash cam videos that many trucks have. And I know that those dash cam videos are not always flattering. Sometimes they do show the drivers doing things they shouldn't, but they often show a jury, this driver was doing none of those things that you might have assumed, and they can be very, very powerful.
Well, in the next clip that we have a different type of perspective on trucking that seemed to influence what this juror thought. And I'll play that clip right now.
Transportation in, just in the United States, I think it is, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but it's at least a third or more of the reason, of the rising CO2 level in the United States. It's because of the fact that we have so many cars on the road all the time, and we have constant transportation and goods moving around that, most of the things that, they're not super important. I don't know. There are better ways to transport, and we're not using those means. And what ends up happening is that we crowd the highways. We make it impossible for people to get around. We, load up big trucks and send them all over the country. And it's a pretty dangerous job. That's why it's so high pay. And so it's basically big companies using people to get their profit. And if those people go through the traumatic event of accidentally killing someone through their own human error, they then go to court and try to say that they're not liable. And all of this together, it just feels like they know what they're doing. They're not trying to make it better. They are just trying to get away with as much money as they possibly can in every single scenario.
All right, Rachel, an environmental perception, not brought out real strong, but when you listen to it, you go well, gee, there's an undertone there that apparently influences the rest of your perspective on trucking.
Exactly right. This is another example of personal experience, knowledge, personal ideologies or worldviews, as I often call them, kind of pervading a juror's overall attitude about the industry as a whole and this particular driver and this truck. If that juror believes that trucks really shouldn't be on the road because they're polluting our environment, she's almost looking for reasons to be critical of the driver, of the company, because of that overall negative view. So this is also something that trucking defendants should consider exploring to the extent you can during that voir dire process to try and flag these types of attitudes.
Now, the folks in the seminar who have been here over the last several days have heard your comments about the C-suite witnesses on that. Mm-hmm. And if they haven't, I mean, what was it so important that they didn't listen to us? But we're going to play a clip right now in terms of a witness, a perspective of the role of upper management with regard to a claim.
I think that it's the responsibility of the head of the company, number one, to make sure that all of his departments are equally staffed or appropriately staffed. If he's going to have that much technology, he needs somebody there that's going to be able to read the technology and bring it to him and say, we need to do this. We need to reprimand this gentleman because he's not listening, or he's not upholding our standards. So I just think that he was maybe a little not really, he was negligent. He should have had someone that would carry out his company's policies, and his policies need to be a little stricter.
All right, that juror's perspective is, a total disassociation by upper management, that they didn't know, in this case, that the driver had overspeeds, overbrakes, lack of connection. Rachel, in terms of that perspective or in terms of that evidence, how do we deal with that?
Mm-hmm. So the way to deal with this is to make sure that your C-suite executives, your corporate representatives are adequately informed and prepared. So sometimes it can feel like you're protecting the company by separating those C-suite execs from, this particular driver. Well, we didn't have knowledge. This is not a company culture or phenomenon. But what a juror hears when an executive testifies that they weren't aware, they didn't know, is we don't care. That we're telling you safety is a priority, but in reality, it's not. Because what is the C-suite focused on? The jury assumes profits, and you're letting the driver sort of run wild out there, which is not the case, certainly. Often jurors will make comments to us in post-trial interviews that, instead of the CEO, I would have preferred to hear from this driver's supervisor or the safety supervisor, someone who really is boots on the ground and does have the knowledge. So again, if you're going to bring an executive, they need to be knowledgeable, they need to be informed enough to testify to the facts that are relevant to this particular case.
What we have next on these clips are something that are all too familiar, particularly in the most tragic of cases, and that's the sympathy element. And this is what those jurors shared during their deliberations.
I think that the kids, the orphans that have been made out of this tragedy deserve all the damages and punitive damages that they can possibly get. This company, Cuts Corners, doesn't value its employees and the well-being of the general public. They send out people that are not properly trained, that have lied on their resumes. They need to take this. Maybe they'll pay out these damages and then take this as a good deep encouragement to start reinvesting in the people and their staff and the safety of the world around them. And maybe things will change. They need to pay out.
Because of the fact that it was very, very clearly, not only did these two people lose their lives, so we have to look at it from, the angle of, these are two people, there's orphans now because of the negligence caused by this company. It's also the fact that, there is a very clear kind of evidence and history of them kind of turning the other cheek with some, red flag behaviors. And because they were negligent in that way, they're people legit died. So that's where it rose to the level of, like, they deserve compensation because they were wrong. Like, the family was wrong so greatly. Like, they were left 2 children parentless. So that's kind of, I know it's kind of a simple metric for me, but it was a life or death issue.
Sympathy. Bob Tyson, the attorney who's speaking in some of these videos, he says, look, we're all human. You can't leave it at the door. But his advice, and what I do is try to address it up front from voir dire, that we all feel sorry about this tragic situation, and then remind them in the end, the jury instruction, and put it on the screen, that you are not to be guided by sympathy, etc. on that. Rachel, your thoughts in terms of how do you deal with sympathy, and is it something you need to go for or address right from the beginning?
Absolutely. I think the strategy that you outlined is perfect. I recommend making it actually a primary topic during voir dire. Sometimes lawyers will say to me, I'm going to have 15 minutes to address this group of jurors. What should I focus on? And I always say the top questions are about sympathy and damages. And sometimes defense counsel look at me like I'm crazy when they see the questions, which are, acknowledging the sympathy and that plaintiffs are going to ask for a lot of money to compensate either an injured party or the family of someone who lost their life, and asking for a commitment from a juror that you will be able, if the evidence supports it, to look this family in the eye and send them home with no money. A lot of people don't want to address the damages, but as the defendant, but you have to, because the plaintiff's going to bring it up. The sympathy factor is there. We can't escape it. So you need to know who reacts and says, gosh, I just don't know if I could send this family home with nothing. I would hesitate. You can sometimes get those jurors off for cause. Oftentimes not, because they get rehabilitated. They say, I'll do my best. But you will have flagged those jurors that did hesitate, and they should be at the top of your strike list.
Yeah, 2 of the big things I think of. Number 1 is to show empathy myself, express sympathy myself. So it's not a situation where we're coming in cold and heartless on this, but, we're just following what the law says on it. That's
right, and I think sometimes that's all a juror wants from defense counsel is the acknowledgement. Sometimes defense counsel are hesitant because you don't want to make it seem like an apology or an acceptance of responsibility. But as a human being, for you to acknowledge the tragic nature of an injury or a death and have that empathy, I think that's all the jury wants to see from you. And then you can say, but we're here to do a job. We're here to follow the law, highlighting the law for the jurors, that this is not me, Doug Marcello, telling you this. This is the law. And as jurors, you are sworn to follow that law. And that can be really powerful for them in the deliberation room. When someone starts to talk about sympathy and having a hard time with the concept of a defense verdict, the others can say, but we got the law from the judge. We all agreed to follow it. And the others can reluctantly follow suit.
It's kind of like you said before. The second thing is get that, or at least during voir dire, make that pledge that they will not be governed by sympathy, and then remind them in closing that they have taken an oath to follow the rules, follow the law, and that's what the law is on that. So
exactly.
Yeah. One of the last areas we'll cover here is when you pick jurors, a lot of times you're looking for folks who are in a similar situation as what your client is, like that truck driver I told you about and his father. Well, this is what the jurors said, and this is their perspective in terms of having family members or friends who are in the trucking business.
Raise your hand and let me if you have a family member or a close personal friend that's a truck driver. All right, so I see Yvette, Ravon, and Grace, your hand is up as well. Ravon, who do you know that's a truck driver?
One of my girlfriend's fiance is a truck driver.
Yeah, one of my cousins is a truck driver, and he's nice. He's a nice person. I just don't know. It's the idea of him being the driver of an 80-ton truck scares the heck out of me.
I have 4 cousins and my daughter's uncle who are truck drivers, and 2 of them own their own company. So I know pretty much what they have to always get, especially here. I live in PA. For me, it's like if there's so much things in place already by the state and you're still making mistakes, it's because you're negligent.
I had a friend's husband
Yeah, he drove an 18-wheeler, even though he didn't go out of state. He drove from pretty much central PA, where we are, to the Poconos and back every day. That's what he did. He delivered eggs. And they had him on a very strict log, how many hours he could drive. He had to wear, like he had a dash cam, double ways, like they recorded him. Everything was super logged and monitored and specific. And that was for a very tiny company. There were only 10 trucks on the road. And if you had 3 infractions, not write-ups, 3 infractions, period, you were suspended without pay for a week.
Yeah, my father and his brother are both CDL drivers, and my son, as part of his job function, it's not his primary job function, but he's a truck driver as part of it. And so I'm fairly familiar with the requirements, and I know that my dad's fully retired now, but in his years, he never had a single accident on the road. And so I think the expectation of safety and the expectation that you're not going to cause an accident are fairly high across the trucking industry. And so that's kind of what scares me about the data I see in this case.
Well, in this case, Rachel, these folks were in the trucking or had friends and family in the trucking business, but they still had this company to a fairly high standard. Right. In terms of, is it good for you, bad for you, or just depend on the case?
Definitely depends on the case and depends on the juror. There's a strong phenomenon in psychology where we do identify with people that we have something in common with. It's called the in-group bias or in-group favoritism. So there can be a tendency to want to align yourself with and sort of defend someone that's in a similar situation. So that's why we often think, I want a juror who has family in trucking. But there's another phenomenon called the black sheep effect, whereby if you are in the industry or you have a close family member or friend who is, and you feel like, you know what, the industry as a whole does do a good job, and truckers are out there giving an essential service to our country, our economy, and then they see an example of a driver who was negligent in some way, or a company who maybe could have done more or doesn't do as much as the company that they're familiar with, then those jurors can be even more critical to say, I have a high standard because I've seen trucking companies doing a great job, and this company doesn't meet that standard. So then they can sort of distance themselves and say, this driver is not like my father, for example. And because of that, I will find the driver at fault, have an even higher standard perhaps than other jurors might.
Yeah, like in this case, the one juror notes that his father and his son are in trucking, but his father never had an accident.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Years ago, Jerry Spence had, I believe it was a bad faith case against an insurance company, and to the surprise of everybody, left an insurance vice president on the jury. God, I think at the time it was the largest verdict in California history, because it was his belief, and what turned out, just like you said, that insurance executive felt that what this other company had done was totally wrong and against everything that they should have done in those circumstances. And like you said, in terms of the black sheep effect, this was a bad actor within his industry, and he applied that to it as well.
That's right. So in each case, as defense counsel, you have to think carefully about, is my driver or the policies that my company has a good example and one that another driver affiliated juror would feel good about and be able to defend? Or is this an example where they might say that falls below the standard that I personally know, and that becomes a problem?
Rachel, I got you. I'm going to take advantage of you for some free advice to the safety directors and folks here. Your perspective in terms of jurors. I always tell folks, look, don't jaywalk. Assume they're looking at you at all times. Assume they're trying to come up with something or judge you the entire time. When you're at trial, and you're a company representative, or you're there with the company, your thoughts in terms of what the jury's looking at and whether or not you're on 24/7 the whole time.
You're definitely on 24/7. The jurors are watching everything. I find sometimes they're watching even more closely when the action is lulled, if you will. They want to know how you interact with your colleagues, with opposing counsel, when you don't think there's an audience. There's definitely an expectation that everyone should be professional. In a recent example, we just came off of a trial in person in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we interviewed those jurors after the trial. We got a defense verdict, and they said, we felt like plaintiff's counsel were a little unprofessional, and we really appreciated that defense counsel showed up every day, dressed appropriately, they were prepared, and they acted with respect the entire time in the courtroom. So jurors really expect and appreciate that respect, but also being a human. Even if you're the CEO of a large trucking company, you can still be a human. You can still find ways to relate to the jurors and to relate to the others around you. That could be a big benefit if the jurors see that you're a good guy or good gal. You're a real person just like they are.
But my goal was always to be the nicest person in the room.
Yes.
And I figured, even if we don't win, they're not going to hurt us in that regard. So.
Yeah, if you can at least avoid the anger factor, then hopefully you can temper, if you're going to lose, temper whatever potential verdict is coming your way.
Rachel, thank you as always.
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug.
Okay. Well, I greatly appreciate Dr. Coangelo's time and insights on that, and Magnus' generosity in doing this mock jury trial for us, providing us with the insights, letting us step back outside of the industry and take a look at what people bring to the jury room in terms of their perspectives of our industry in various aspects that we might not appreciate by being so close to them all the time. Just kind of having a different point of view. It's like a couple years ago, Christmas Eve. I'm doubled over in pain. My wife drives me over to the hospital. We get in there, they run some tests, and the nurse says, it's kind of what we thought. You have a kidney stone. I'll get you some medication for that to relieve the pain for it. And as I'm waiting there, my wife interrupts and goes, that's okay. We've discussed this, and we're going to have this kidney stone naturally. I'm his kidney stone coach. I'll help him breathe. Different perspective. Put things in a different perspective. And hopefully that's what some of this did today in terms of the video that we showed the mock jury and their comments on it. Now, before I leave, got a couple text messages from folks with some questions that I wanted to answer. One of them, Doug, do you own any other shirts? The answer to that is yes. Yes, I do. And to prove it, So there you go. Hope that answers that one. And the other thing was the schlocky special effect with the coffee you did the other day. Was that something that was done by some outside source? The answer is no. I asked Jacob what our budget was for that. I could tell when he started to laugh rather strongly when I said the word budget, that there wasn't anything in there. But let me assure you that no coffee was spilled in the making of this production. All right. Hey, look, thank you very much. Come back. Promise you I'll ditch the jokes. And we'll see you the next time.